And thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. Happy Friday. The first one, which is often called a firing, but it wasn't, it was a resignation. The first one came just 24 days into the new administration. 3.5 weeks in, and they were already shedding their first senior staff. February 13th, Trump National Security Advisor Mike Flynn resigned from the White House. That was in February. Then in March, next out was the Deputy White House Chief of Staff, Katie Walsh. Then in April, it was the Deputy National Security Advisor, KT McFarland. Then in May, it was the White House Communications Director, #1, Mike Dubke. He was out in May. Then in June, it was the Vice President's Chief of Staff, a guy named Josh Pitcock. Stick a pin in that one for a second. Vice President, Chief of Staff. And then in July ended up being quite busy. I swear they saved this up for when I went on vacation in part of July. In July, they lost the Deputy Chief of Staff of the National Security Council, who was a Breitbart person named Tara Dahl. Then they lost the White House Press Secretary, Sean Spicer. Then they lost the Assistant White House Press Secretary, Michael Short. Then they lost Reince Priebus, White House Chief of Staff. Then they lost White House Communications Director #2, Anthony Scaramucci. And then we rolled into the lazy days of August. And in a normal universe version of Washington, nothing happens in August. But in this one, August meant it was time to fire or accept the resignation of the Senior Director for Intelligence at the National Security Council, Ezra Cohen-Watnick. And then, I should say about him, he's a guy who nobody was quite sure why he was there in the first place, but he was gone as of August. Then all on the same day, it was White House Chief Strategist Steve Bannon and a special assistant to the president named Julia Hahn and a director of public liaison, the director of the public liaison office at the White House. He was also out. And then the special advisor on regulatory reform, Carl Icahn, he was out too that same day. He appears to have had some law enforcement interest follow him home from that job. Then a week later, still in August, it was that strange guy who doesn't really have a job title, Sebastian Gorka. All gone. I mean, and this is just like the people who have knowable titles, right? All gone. And this administration isn't that old. This doesn't show like a revolving door. This is like somebody turning the carousel motor up to 100 miles an hour and people just fling off the thing with centripetal force into the night, right? And that, of course, that's not even counting the no-notice firings of dozens of federal prosecutors and the firing of the acting attorney general, Sally Yates, and the firing of the FBI director, James Comey. I mean, this is all just White House. Last night, the New York Times broke the news that on the day Robert Mueller was appointed special counsel to investigate the Russia matter, President Trump reportedly lost his mind at the attorney general, Jeff Sessions, because Sessions had recused himself from anything related to Russia. Quote, when the phone call informing him about the Mueller appointment ended, White House counsel Don McGahn relayed the news to the president and his aides. Almost immediately, Mr. Trump lobbed a volley of insults at Jeff Sessions, telling the attorney general it was his fault they were in the current situation. Trump told Sessions that choosing him to be the attorney general was one of the worst decisions he has made. He called him an idiot, and he said he should resign. The Times then reports that Jeff Sessions did resign. He wrote a resignation letter to the president and gave it to the president, but the president would not accept it. Quote, Trump ended up rejecting Sessions' resignation letter after senior members of his administration argued that dismissing the AG would only create more problems for a president who'd already fired an FBI director and a national security advisor. So his senior advisors told him that accepting Mr. Sessions' resignation would only sow more chaos inside the administration. Really? The idea that this administration didn't want to let anybody go. It would attract too much attention. They were afraid of shedding anyone as of May. They took drastic steps, even against the president's wishes, to stop losing key and high-profile staff as of May because that would be too much chaos? Really? They stopped letting people go? How does that square with their actual behavior? It doesn't make sense that senior White House advisors wouldn't let the president fire anyone too high profile as of May, because in reality, as of May, they were just getting started with the flinging people off the carousel into the good night. And that went all through the summer, and now it has continued into the fall. The Times further reports that President Trump asked again if he could please fire Jeff Sessions in July. And again, the answer was reportedly no. No, that would be too disruptive. Too disruptive to fire somebody in July? Why? Because Jeff Sessions might clog up the outdoor that they were using to fire all these other people, and then there might be a pileup? He was going to block the fire exit? Honestly, that explanation for why the president couldn't fire Jeff Sessions when he wanted to, it honestly makes no sense, given the number of people fired from this White House. This situation with the president and the attorney general supposedly having this standoff, it will end weirdly, I can assure you. But something about the way that conflict between the president and the attorney general, something about the way that palace intrigue is being described is off when you put it in context against the way the White House was otherwise behaving at the time these supposed conflicts really came to a head. Regardless of Jeff Sessions, though, today there is one new name to add to the list of people being flung off the carousel in Washington. Today we got the resignation of the press secretary to the vice president, a man named Mark Lotter. Vice President Mike Pence's press secretary, gone as of today. Vice President Mike Pence lost his chief of staff back in June, lost his press secretary today. And for all the turmoil in this White House and all of the scandals about various people and the quitting and the disappearances of all these senior staff, Vice President Mike Pence has been caught out in way more of these scandals than his bland Beltway press coverage would have you believe. I mean, even going all the way back to the first dramatic departure from this White House, going all the way back to Mike Flynn, right? Mike Pence was the head of the transition. This is a letter that he received as head of the transition, notifying him in writing about concerns that soon-to-be National Security Advisor Mike Flynn appeared to be on the payroll of foreign governments. In addition to this notification in writing from Congress, Mike Flynn's lawyers also said that they, too, notified the transition in person, telling them that Flynn was on the payroll of foreign governments. Vice President Mike Pence was running the transition when all those warnings about Mike Flynn came in. He nevertheless claims that he never heard, no idea. As head of the transition, he had no idea, nobody could have had any idea that Mike Flynn might have been on the payroll of foreign governments. That is plainly not true. Vice President Mike Pence also solemnly intoned to the American people that there was no way that Mike Flynn had had discussions about Russian sanctions with Russian officials during the transition. Despite the fact that he said it very solemnly, that was also not true. Vice President Mike Pence also insisted that there were no contacts at all between the Trump campaign and Russian officials during the campaign. That, of course, was not true either. Vice President Mike Pence insisted that James Comey was fired as FBI director because of an internal process at the Department of Justice. Had nothing at all to do with the White House's needs or desires, certainly nothing to do with the president's feelings about the Russia investigation. Although that's what Mike Pence told the American people about the firing of James Comey, we now know that President Trump gave Pence a letter that outlined his rationale for wanting to fire James Comey the day before the Department of Justice ever produced their rationale for why the Justice Department might want him fired too. So Mike Pence's Comey firing explanation was not only not true, we can tell based on the timeline that he knew it was not true at the time that he said it. Oh, but wait, there's more. This week, Mike Flynn's son, Mike Flynn Jr., was described by NBC News as being a subject of the investigation by Robert Mueller in the special counsel's office. Mike Pence has a good one about Mike Flynn Jr. as well. Controversy, of course, emerged during the campaign, but also during the transition about toxic conspiracy theories that had circulated during the campaign. And controversy arose specifically around Mike Flynn Jr. continuing to defend some of the most odious conspiracy theories from the campaign, even after a disturbed young man showed up at a D.C. pizza parlor and started shooting because of that conspiracy theory. Mike Flynn Jr., in the ensuing controversy, was fired from the Trump transition. Again, Mike Pence was head of the Trump transition. His explanation for what happened there? was that Mike Flynn Jr. wasn't really being fired from the transition because he was never actually part of it. That was not true. Mike Flynn Jr. was part of the transition. We have evidence for this, but in the form of, among other things, the fact that Mike Flynn Jr. had been happily emailing his conspiracy theories to reporters from his official Trump transition email address for quite some time before Mike Pence tried to get away with lying about that, too. So Mike Pence has a real problem in the Russia investigation and in some of these White House scandals. Again and again and again, Vice President Pence really has made brazenly untrue public statements about some of the most controversial elements of this new administration and the Russia scandal specifically. Now, Vice President Pence, having already lost his chief of staff, today he lost his press secretary. Vice President Pence has himself hired a high-powered Washington, D.C. lawyer to represent him on the Trump-Russia scandal. After the vice president took the unprecedented step of setting up his own political action committee, something no vice president has done at this point in a new administration ever, after he set up that PAC, Team Pence initially floated the idea that this PAC might be used as a fundraising vehicle to raise money to pay for Mike Pence's legal fees in the Russia scandal. After they got some pushy press inquiries about that, though, the vice president backed off those plans, and they now say the PAC won't be used to fund his legal defense. We don't know how the vice president is planning to pay for his legal representation on the Russia matter, but he's not a man of Trump-level means. It's going to be a real issue for him and his family. It's got to be on their minds. In July, the head of the Office of Government Ethics, Walter Shaub, left that job in frustration. You probably remember it was a very high-profile resignation. As he left, he warned that one of the things we should watch for at the Government Ethics Office, now that he was leaving, he said we should watch for who the Trump administration was going to appoint as his successor at that ethics office. Walter Shaub warned us as he was leaving office that the administration might try to pass over the most senior person under him at that office who would otherwise have been in line for the job. He said that person is highly qualified and would do an excellent job with the ethics office. He said it should send red flags for everybody if they bypass that senior person, if they bypass that senior official who's next in line to be the acting director, and instead, he warned us, watch to see if they instead want to pick this one other particular guy who works at the office. The Trump administration then did exactly that. They picked that lower-ranking staffer in the ethics office who Walter Shaub warned explicitly should be expected to have a more pliable attitude on ethics toward this White House. Well, that is the guy who's in charge of the ethics office now, and he has now revised the rules around legal defense funds for administration personnel. Under the new interpretation of ethics rules around these things, Mike Pence and any other White House staffer who needs to fund his legal defense will be able to accept unlimited anonymous donations from lobbyists to defray any legal bills that arise out of these White House scandals. Oh, good. What could possibly go wrong? If there's one thing I want lobbyists to be able to anonymously fund, it's the legal defense for White House officials facing the Russia inquiry. Tonight, the administration announced that they do not want this to be seen as a change in policy. I'm sure they don't. But the outgoing director at the ethics office, Walter Shaub, has been banging the drum over this for the last couple of days since they made this change, warning that this really is a turn for the worse. Today, for the second time, we learned of a witness being called to testify before one of what we believe are the two grand juries that have been convened by Special Counsel Robert Mueller in his investigation. The first person we know to have testified to the grand jury is Rinat Akhmetshin, Soviet-born naturalized U.S. citizen who was part of that Trump Tower meeting last June during the campaign. Rinat Akhmetshin is known to have ties to Russian military intelligence. He was the first person we know who spoke to the Mueller grand jury. The second person we now know who has spoken to the Mueller grand jury was today. It was Jason Maloney, who is the spokesperson for Trump campaign chair Paul Manafort. It's a little bit weird to think about a spokesperson being called to testify before a grand jury, but presumably that reasoning will all become clear in the end. Paul Manafort does appear to have a real bullseye on him in this investigation, both in terms of the Mueller part of it and in terms of what's happening in Congress. The top Democrat on the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, Dianne Feinstein, yesterday she was asked by reporters why there'd been such a delay in getting Paul Manafort to come in and give testimony to that committee weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks after it had been announced that he had been asked to come in. She responded by attributing the delay, in part, to the committee's own need to up its game when it comes to investigating complex financial matters. Dianne Feinstein announced yesterday that her committee has just hired 2 new investigative financial staffers to, quote, trace the money. Now that those investigative financial staffers are in place, Senator Feinstein suggested that that interview with Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort might go ahead. What that means for potential liability or money trails leading up to the White House, we don't know. Paul Manafort is long gone from Trump world, right? He resigned from the Trump campaign more than a year ago now. But, you know, even since they've been in the White House, we are starting to realize that in Trump world, the way this works is there's going to be a lot of people left behind. There are going to be a lot of people involved in lots of interesting things who are long gone by the time we realize what exactly they know and what they might have been up to before they left. When it comes to a scandal and an ongoing investigation like this, though, just the fact that somebody has resigned or been fired, it's not necessarily enough to get their smell off of you. The very first guy they shed from the new administration, who didn't even make it 4 weeks in, Mike Flynn, he is still ricocheting around this White House, breaking stuff. For example, in this damning and intriguing new report that has just come out from BuzzFeed News. That's next.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.